Coming to the next segment for the day, considering we all are here to learn little something about foreign policy and international relations, and we are here to role play as diplomats, so we thought, why not get somebody who's a veteran in the field and has represented our country internationally? So the person who's going to be addressing all of you is an Indian diplomat who has served for over 3 decades and has been an ambassador of India to Greece and Cuba. He has served in several countries in Africa, Europe, Middle East, and for over 10 years with various UN organizations in Geneva and Vienna. He set up and headed the Investment and Technology Promotion Division of the Ministry of External Affairs. We are proud and honored to have Ambassador Bhaskar Balakrishnan with us today. So, sir will be addressing all of you, followed by a short question answer session. Yes, sir. Over to
Okay.
you.
Well, namaste to all of you. After that vigorous dance, I'm sure it will be a bit quieter for me to talk to you. So let me start off by saying that this is a very special year, 2020. It's the 75th anniversary of the UN, which was set up basically in 1945. But since then, there have been many changes in the world. Many new countries have come about, and there are many global challenges which require international action. Now, today, if you look at the UN after 75 years, the public perception of the UN is not so good because it seems to have lost credibility and it is seen as unable to take action, especially in dealing with some pressing problems. And of course, the UN has not been able to bring about peace, stability, and development for most of our people. What are the reasons for this kind of gap? Well, first of all, UN Security Council needs to be expanded from 15 to at least 30 because the membership has grown up and it has gone well beyond, I think, 192. And no other UN agency has an executive body which is smaller than 30. The Security Council is stuck in the past with only 15 members. All other UN bodies, including the Atomic Energy Agency, they have at least 30 countries on their executive board. So Security Council has to be expanded. And I would say it needs to be expanded to at least 30 countries. With both permanent members, that means the 5 permanent members, increase them to 10, and the elected members, also you increase them by another uh, 10 to 20. And now the other problem is the veto. Why should 5 countries be able to block any of these 5 countries? We have the power to block a decision which everybody wants to take. So clearly, the veto is not democratic. So we have to eliminate or limit the use of the veto. Actually, the 5 permanent 5, whenever they use the veto, they do feel a bit ashamed to do that, and they actually go out of their way to try to explain to the public and justify why they use the veto. But the veto really needs to be removed. Now, of course, this is a very difficult goal to accomplish because any changes in the UN Constitution require all 5 permanent members to approve it. So none of them are likely to approve something which eliminates their veto power. But anyway, we'll have to overcome that problem in due course. The other point is the head of the UN, the Secretary General. He is not really directly chosen by the General Assembly. The Security Council actually nominates one candidate, and that goes to the General Assembly, which has only the choice of either you approve him or don't approve him. The real election takes place in the Security Council, where all kinds of bargaining and things are done. And this is not really a democratic process. If you really want to have an effective UN Secretary General, then he should be chosen directly by the UN General Assembly. Some organizations do that, for example, the FAO. So there's no reason why the UN can't have the same system. It will be much more democratic. Now, another problem with the UN is it's always running out of money. Financially, it's very weak. And there are many reasons for this. Let's start with how the UN gets its budget. So it depends too much on the large contributors. The US pays 22%, China now pays 12%, followed by Japan and the EU. And 85, as many as 85 countries pay very little. They pay less than 0.01% of the budget. India pays 0.83% only. So the UN is dependent on payments by large contributors, and there are many countries which don't pay on time. Countries must pay their dues to the UN by the end of January each year. But many countries, including the US, which pays the biggest share, they don't pay at all by that date. And there are many countries which are behind in their payments to the UN. As a result, the UN is always having a cash flow problem, and it can't implement many of the programs which it is approved to implement. So these are all illnesses of the UN and the UN system also, which need to be treated. Now, civil society needs to play a much stronger role and influence governments to take action to fix all these problems. Now, you might say that what can civil society do? It doesn't really have any official power in the UN. Well, we have seen a young Greta Thunberg who started this movement for climate change. She was a young teenager, and before you realized what had happened, she was actually occupying a very important place in the climate summit. Everybody started listening to her, and today she is listened to with a lot of attention because countries know that she represents the voice of youth. Now, I said that civil society doesn't have an official voice in the UN. There is one exception, and that is the International Labour Organization. ILO is the only organization where employees and workers, delegates, have voting rights, which add up to the same as governments. So they have equal voting rights with the governments. And this is probably one of the reasons why the ILO has survived two world wars and continues to function. And in fact, despite the threats of, for example, the US to withdraw from the ILO, it still continues to function to safeguard trade union and employers' rights all across the world. So there's a lesson here that somehow civil society must be given a greater unofficial and official role also in the UN. Now, we all have in the UN heard about the Sustainable Development Goals. Back in 2015, all the UN member states adopted the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. So these are the goals which all countries agreed that they will try to achieve by 2030. Now, achieving these goals like ending hunger, clean water, health for all, it requires money, funding, besides technology and, of course, important governance efforts also. But the problem has been, we have seen in the last 5 years since the SDGs were adopted, that funding for achieving the SDGs is not forthcoming. And there is no political will among the richer countries to come up with funding for achieving the SDGs. Most of the work has to be done by the poorer countries, but then without funds, it's difficult to do that. Another example is climate change, mitigation and adaptation. Everybody knows that we have to deal with climate change if we have to save the planet and save our future. We have the technology available. The technology is coming. It's within our hands. It's moving every day. Every day there are new advances, but there is no finance available to finance climate change actions. Now let's see what happened in climate change. The US administration actually pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which was a big agreement for climate change. But although the US government in Washington pulled out of the Paris Agreement, many US states, such as California and New York, they remain committed to implementing the Paris Agreement. Now, if you look at New York or California or such states, they are actually as big as many countries in the world. So the question arises that even though the federal government doesn't pulls out the Paris Agreement, if we can get the large states of the US to follow and implement the Paris Agreement, then actually we are somehow or the other keeping it going. In India, for example, Uttar Pradesh is one of the states which is probably bigger than many countries in the world. So this is a situation which is there in many countries, Australia, Canada, uh, and so on, which are federal in nature, where the federal government sometimes is not willing to support climate change. The states may be willing to do so. So we have to somehow leverage the support of the states in such countries. Now, the last point I want to make before I go to Q&A is that in the UN system over the years, the last 20, 30 years, what has happened is that the development role of the UN is being cut down. Lack of funding, lack of approval of projects and programs. And there are some countries which are only interested in strengthening the regulatory functions and in promoting their business through the UN. And they are cutting down on supporting for development. So let's see, for example, UNIDO, which was set up in the 1970s for helping developing countries to industrialize. By 1994, the US withdrew from it. And since then, many other developed countries have withdrawn from it. So this is a symptom of the lack of political will and support for development, which is there in some advanced countries. Now, this is something which might get worse because of COVID-19. Most of the developed countries, they are facing economic situations. So, of course, they are less likely to give funding for climate change and for development. So this means that as countries which are developing, we have to look to ourselves for raising the money and financing climate change and development efforts. So in a sense, what Prime Minister said about Atma Nirbharta is not only for India, but it's for all the developing countries across the world. We have to depend on ourselves and raise the resources and the effort to make development a success and to achieve the SDGs. So the UN actually is at a crossroads 75 years on. It is seen as ineffective, does not meet the challenges of the present day world. And for many countries, the UN is just a place where words are and a lot of talk goes on, but there is no action and there is no funding for actual development efforts. So this is a challenge that you, my young friends, are going to face, and I think you all need to be conscious of the difficult road ahead in terms of making the UN more effective. Either, when you're faced with an obstacle on the road, you have to go around it. If you can't remove it, you have to go around it, under it, or over it. So we have to now find ways of going achieving the objectives despite the problems which the UN faces. So I'll stop here and I'll leave the floor to you for your questions. Thank you all for listening to me, and thank you for the organizers for giving me this opportunity to address you digitally. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. There are quite a few questions. We will recognize them one by one, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Yes, the first question is by Specpol Germany Lenin. Yes,
Yeah.
delegate.
Okay. What is the question?
Specpol Germany.
What's my doubt is that being United Nations, some countries don't have voting rights because they don't fund United Nations more frequently. Like Venezuela, they are already facing financial crisis in their country, so they can't provide money to United Nations. So recently, United Nations taken off their voting rights. So is it right to United Nations to do like that to countries like this?
Okay. Should I reply one by one or listen to the whole lot?
Yes, yes. You can reply one by one. We'll take them one by one.
Okay. Specpol Germany. Good question. In the UN, what happens is that if you don't pay your contributions for 2 years, if you go 2 years in arrears, then you lose the right to vote. But if you are facing some extremely difficult situation and beyond your control and you cannot make your payments, then the organization, I mean, the member states can decide to give you some kind of a relief. The relief can be either to allow you to participate and come up with some plan of payment of the past due. So basic rule is if you are 2 years behind in your payments, you can't vote. That's generally a fair thing because you are expected to make some effort to pay your. So it's not that there's an intention to single out any country, but the rules are there that any country which is more than 2 years behind in payment will lose the right to vote, can participate in the meeting, can sit there, but you cannot have voting rights. And this has happened to many countries. There are many countries which have lost the right to vote on various occasions in various UN bodies. So it's not something which is unusual. I hope that answers your question. Over to you.
Yes, sir. The next question is by Mirwaz. I'm just putting the person on spotlight.
Yeah.
Yes, delegate.
Sir, we've seen that Kashmir has been in turmoil between India and Pakistan for the past 70 years. So, what according to you is a solution we should look at? Should UN intervene in this, or there are some other things that we should look at to solve the Kashmir dispute?
Okay.
Yes,
So
sir.
in this case, now, of course, the UN has a role in settling disputes, especially disputes which can result in war. But it can only play a role if the parties agree to have the UN involved. Now, in this case, India has taken the position that the differences with over Kashmir have to be resolved bilaterally with Pakistan. So there's a bilateral track which is there. There has been a composite dialogue process which was pursued for many years. We have the Indus Waters Treaty, where both countries negotiated the sharing of Indus waters that was brokered by the World Bank under the World Bank. So both countries agreed there. Now, in this case, the problem is that there are elements in Pakistan which are continuing to carry out terrorist activities. And the main condition which India has for carrying on this dialogue further or resuming the dialogue is that there should be a complete stop to terrorist activity. So this is the basic problem. We cannot have, India feels it cannot negotiate under the gun of terrorism. And, if you look at back in history after the 1971 war, from 1972 up to 1989, which is 16 years, 17 years, there was no terrorism. There was no terrorism across the body, across the LOC. And the relationship between both countries was on the way improving. But ever since the Afghan war ended and the availability of terrorist fighters was there, the situation has changed. Now there is a whole industry of terrorism which is there in Pakistan. A lot of people depend on this activity for their income and livelihood. So once you set up this kind of structure, it is very difficult to remove it. We have seen this happening in Lebanon. We have seen this happening in southern Africa. Once an infrastructure of terrorism is set up, for whatever reason, the state finds it very difficult to remove it. So I'm afraid it is really for Pakistan to really try and dismantle this whole infrastructure of terrorism. If that happens, then I think the climate for dialogue with India will be much, much better. And I think we can expect some results. And we can look at solutions. What are the actual solutions? Right at this stage, it's premature to look at what various models as to how this can be settled. Okay.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Anshuman. Yes, Anshuman.
Good evening, sir. Good afternoon, sir. I have a question that, as you said, Pakistan has a terrorist organization, and they have. Why? What's the motive for the Pakistani government to be okay with them running this type of activities?
Look,
Yes, sir.
it is hard. It is hard for somebody sitting in India to really analyze what goes on within Pakistan. Pakistan is an important country, 200 million people. It has got its own internal dynamics. It has had a long history of military rule, right from the 1950s, where the first coup took place, right through its history. The armed forces, the military in Pakistan has played a big role, either directly in government, when they had the military commander, or indirectly from behind, where they could control and remove the nature of the civil government. So the military establishment in Pakistan is very influential. Behind the scenes, the civilian establishment is not able to prevail over it. And the, as I said, the military is convinced that this kind of terrorist activity is a cheap way uh, of inflicting cuts on India, 1,000 cuts. So long as the military and the intelligence services in Pakistan don't change their mind about this and then don't give up this objective, it's going to be very difficult for the civilian establishment to control this. Uh, it is going to cost Pakistan much more because within Pakistani society, this whole effort to support uh, militant terrorist organizations, especially those which are close to Al Qaeda, and has resulted in a lot of problems within Pakistan, where you find a lot of incidents taking place, especially against certain minorities like Ahmadiyas and the Shias, and of course non-Muslims. So Pakistan society is paying the cost, and the civilians are paying the cost. There is also a regional dimension to this because some parts of Pakistan, like Sindh and Balochistan, they have a different priority for their country. They want development. They want to move ahead with development, and they see a lot of this activity as being detrimental to it. So Pakistan is really creating a lot of problems for itself by following this path. Sooner or later, it'll have to deal with this problem. In the past, they already had one bad experience after the Lal Masjid and the problems in the Swat Valley with the kind of terrorist elements, which I think they took some action. But that problem is still very much there. It's endemic. It's like a virus within Pakistan, which will come out at any time and threaten the whole state. So that is how we look at it. In the long term, this is not going to help the Pakistani state or the people. Over.
Thank you so much, sir, for that. We will entertain two more questions. And this question, next question, is by Sankal from Indo Pakistan Special Summit. Yes, Sankal.
So my question is this: what is the chance of India getting permanent membership of UN?
Yeah, this is, of course, a question everybody asks. Now, look, as I said, any change in the UN constitution requires all the five permanent members. Any one of the permanent five members can block it. So, as far as India's candidacy for a permanent seat in the Security Council is concerned, I think out of the permanent members, we have the support of four of them. One of them, China, is not going to support us for their own geostrategic reasons. Plus, of course, there is another alternative proposal for the enlargement of the Security Council, which is led by Pakistan and a number of other countries. It's called Uniting for Consensus. So, in that model, the Security Council is to be expanded to 30, and there will be no permanent members added. So, the countries, at least as far as we are concerned, India is concerned, we have the support of four of them, but because China's opposition is there, it is going to be blocked unless China changes its position for whatever reason it is. And so this is along with Japan, Germany, and Brazil, these are the four countries who everybody recognizes deserve a permanent seat on the Security Council. So although there is no immediate chance of getting it, but we have to keep this demand on the table and press it. It is a diplomatic negotiation because uh, we will have to negotiate when the Security Council is expanded. Now, last time it was expanded was many, many years ago. Increase the size. Uh, Today, everybody knows that the Security Council has to be expanded. They all agree that it should be done. The difference of views comes in how it should be expanded. Permanent category, non-permanent category, veto, not veto. So these questions are all on the table. It's part of the international game of negotiations. Now, although we are not in the permanent five in the Security Council, we will be one of the non-permanent members. We'll have the seat from 2021 January. So we will be there for 2 years in the Security Council as a non-permanent member. So we will play a certain role in that body uh, for that period. Now there is another group which has come up outside the UN because that's called the G20. That is the group of 20 most largest economies, and they actually are functioning in some ways like an enlarged Security Council, although without any legal power. But what is happening is a lot of the global issues are being discussed in the G20. Now, India is a member of the G20 and is an active member. We will be the G20 chairman in 2022. This year, Saudi Arabia is the chairman. Next year, it will be Italy. After that, 2022, it will be India's turn. So we are playing a role there. In other UN bodies, for example, in the ILO or the IAEA, we have a more or less a permanent seat in their governing body. In the IAEA, we are always there permanent because we have fairly big nuclear power. In the ILO, we also have because of our labor force. So in most of the other UN bodies, India has a kind of permanent seat, but there the permanent seats are not given to countries by name. You have to earn your permanent seat. For example, the ILO calculates the number of employment, and based on that, they work out which are the 10 most important countries, and they get permanent. The IEA has a calculation based on your nuclear industry. So every UN body has the system of coming up with a list of countries which are to be permanently on their board. No UN body has a system where countries are named as permanent members. It's only the UN which names 5 countries as permanent members. So this is a big anomaly. But as I said, the 5 permanent members will never give it up unless they really have a serious crisis. So we have to live with this problem. We have to negotiate. As I said, we have to go around it, over it, or under it in the future. Over.
Thank you, sir. I had one question building onto the current question only. So there have been a lot of talks about India accepting the permanent membership without the veto powers. So what do you think about that? Should India go ahead and accept, and over the course of time, India will eventually get the veto powers? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, here, if you have 5 more permanent members and you say they do not have veto powers, then you will have 3 categories of members. You will have non-permanent members who have 2-year terms. You will have 5 permanent members without the right of veto, and you will have 5 permanent members with the right of veto. Now, if you are going to expand the council and give 5 permanent members, and then you are going to argue that the veto should not be there, then what is the difference if whatever reason is there for not giving the veto is also applicable to the 5 permanent members? Just because you have the US, Russia, China, France, and UK at the end of World War II, they were on the winning side. Uh, they have the veto. Today, the UK and France are by no means, they are behind Japan and Germany in the economic size, and India is comparable to China. So the argument that they deserve the veto is really non-existent. I mean, look at the Security Council. They still have not changed the name of the Soviet Union as the occupant of the seat. When Soviet Union broke up
Yes.
and Russia took the seat, they have not changed the charter, amended the charter to replace the USSR by Russia. Similarly, the seat of China was being occupied by the Republic of China.
Republic of China.
When
Yes.
that was Taiwan. Now, when People's Republic of China occupied that permanent seat, the charter has not been changed. So the charter still reads Union of Soviet Social Republic and Republic of China. They haven't changed it. So this shows that how difficult it is to even amend the charter of the UN, because it's such a sensitive topic. When you are talking about things like the veto or more permanent members, the difficulties are quite immense. Over.
Okay, thank you. So there's just one last question which I had, which is in regards to India's foreign policy. It's a biparter. So the first one is India's foreign policy immediately after independence was more like Nehruvian foreign policy, and today it's Modi's foreign policy. So both are very different. One is Modi especially is a strong propagator of this concept called soft power, and has been trying a lot in order to lobby and put India on the world map. So, what do you think about both of these policies, and which one, according to you, is better, or a combination of both is something that India should follow? And the second part is, what are your thoughts on soft power versus the hard power, or should we go ahead with something like smart power?
Yeah, well, when India became independent, Nehru Nehru was a respected leader even at that time in the world stage. Uh, he was 61 when he became prime minister. He was India's prime minister for the longest period.
Yes.
So at that time, his views on foreign policy were quite disproportionately listened to in the world stage. Now, you might remember at that time that it was the Cold War period. The Soviet Union and the US, the two blocks, were fighting each other for control over the world. So Nehru saw the need to be independent of falling under any of them. Right, left, and center countries were joining one bloc or the other. The Warsaw Pact, CETO, CENTO, and
Yes.
alliances. Even India was approached by the US to join in an alliance, which Nehru refused. So Nehru actually saw the need to remain free of this kind of Cold War entanglement for either side. So he built up this independent foreign policy, which gave India the freedom to make its own decisions without having to be by any of the power blocks. Of course, India was economically very weak power at that time, militarily and economically were much weaker. But Nehru did play a role. He actually intervened in the Korean conflict, try and bring about peace. He actually personally advised the Austrian government that because there was a negotiation to get the Soviet and the Allied forces out of Austria, he actually advised the Austrian government not to go to the UN, but to resolve the problem through quiet diplomacy. And they listened to him and they were grateful to him. So he had a huge influence, both personally as well as through his foreign policy at that time. But today, now after 1990, the world has changed. There is no longer a Cold War. The Soviet Union is broken up. Now we have a new situation. We have several powers. We have the US, and now we have China, and we have some other powers. So it's a multipolar world. For a brief period, the US was all dominant. Now we have a multipolar world with countries pursuing their own interests. So our foreign policy again has to be reflect this. We have to deal with a different world situation, not a Cold War. So our government, even from the time of Manmohan Singh onwards, has been following a much more pragmatic foreign policy. We are not bound by any kind of ideology. We try to work for our interests as we see them and for the longer term. Now, we do see that our interests are helped if all developing countries are also progress. So there are certain things which remain in our foreign policy, but the fundamental thing is that now our foreign policy is really pragmatic and based on our own interests. Now, at one time, we would avoid getting involved in international disputes. Uh, when I joined as a young diplomat in the 70s, that time, most of the time, we would be told that, look, India better not get involved in this quarrel or that quarrel. Let's stay out of it. For example, the Arab Israeli thing, let's not get involved in. So that was a time when India felt it was still coming up economically, militarily, and we didn't have the kind of resources and the clout to actually play a role. So we kept out of many problems. Today it's not so. We have become a big economy. We are now the number 5th economy in the world in $3.2 trillion already, and we are likely to go up. We are a huge country consuming energy. So whether we like it or not, India is a big player on global issues, whether it's climate change, international trade, finance, whatever it is, wherever you look. So correspondingly, our foreign policy now is moved. We now play an active role in all global issues. We look at how we can help solve the problem, keeping our interests in mind. So our foreign policy is now quite much more dynamic and pragmatic. And I think the Prime Minister has realized this, and it was coming up even during the time of Manmohan Singh that we were getting more. Like for example, these days, both on the Arab and the Israeli side, we are involved in trying to solve the problem. Any major problem, even the problem which now has between with Taiwan, countries are asking us, what do we think? So our foreign policy now has become much more activist, but very pragmatic and based on our own national interests.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful insight into how the changing world requires a change in foreign policy and adapting to the same. I'm sure all the delegates here have learned a lot about foreign policy from you. So, once again, thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. And we are very grateful for the same.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and good luck to you. Have a nice session.
Thank you. Have a great day, sir.